conversation number 3. I'm pretty sure you
Yeah,
said it was.
technically,
Yeah.
yes.
we're,
Uh,
we're all about the technicalities.
albeit it's difficult. Yeah, even though it's difficult.
Yeah.
We had, where did we leave it off? We left it off with difficulty of seeing a positive vision, a whole bunch of diagnosis about your map of the world. But you brought up before we recorded, that you had something else that you wanted to
Well,
weave into there, a metaphysic angle,
I've
which might
been
be difficult, but we'll see what we can do.
I've been working on the stuff that we were talking about last time, on and off since we had that conversation, and to pick up, well, we could pick up where we left off last time and talk about the positive vision, and I can see how if we allow for the potential for everyone to act in the best way, so rather than 51% working toward positive and 49% working toward negative, we were 100% hypothetically. So it's a boundary condition, a boundary case.
Yes.
Yeah. Then yes, we could support the current population in more fulfilling lives, but less energy intensive lives.
I'll still put an asterisk on. I don't believe that the best way forward is less consumption of energy. But you can keep
I think
elucidating your vision. I just wanted to throw
more
that in there.
efficient consumption, I would say. So less dancing Santas that get thrown out the day after they're bought, and more products that last longer.
Through personal freedom and choice, not through totalitarian force.
Yes, through real accounting of the costs in a market type situation, because no single individual can put it out. So taking away the hidden subsidies of pollution not being the cost of pollution not falling on
Mm,
those who make it. So
do you think that's why people buy stupid things like dancing Santas, or do you think it's more personal moral flaws than
I th-
not in knowing the cost or having it incorporated?
I think that if
And
the
also,
mm,
sorry, I also, this has been bugging me because lots of people say that the solution is to bring the externalized costs of the environment system into the market system and then whoa, market solution. But that assumes A, that you know that it is in fact an external cost and not a benefit, and B, that you know what that cost is.
oh
Because
yeah,
how are you going to put a price on something you don't know what it is, or even if it's positive or negative, as much as we claim that we know?
yeah, that's very true. And to try and say that we can properly enumerate all of those is arrogant, if nothing else. Um,
Yes.
yeah, so that thought process is probably insufficiently thought out, and oh,
I
I'm
think
mm,
there's lots of details here we could argue about, but let's take a step back to the broader vision that we had at the end of the last conversation, which was almost the environmentalist perspective on the world in terms of the map that we were
mm,
discussing. And me and you have messaged quite a lot since then. Um, I don't know, sort of unfortunately, but you sounded like you've had a lot of development
mm,
since that conversation. So maybe that's where we should start.
yeah.
And you
So
also said that you wanted to weave in um, the metaphysical part of your
mm,
map.
something
We'll try not to
that
go too far up on the deep end of the religious conversation.
yeah, I plan to sort of go in the shallows of that, but I watched a conversation podcast that Jordan Peterson did, or a couple of them, where the thrust was things aren't as bad as they look, or they aren't as bad as they're claimed to be, and also looking at the modern environmental movement and examining the hypocrisies therein. So, like the hypocrisy of people flying in a private jet to a climate conference where they talk about how, oh, we need to reduce CO2 emissions. Yes, we need to stop all coal being burned. And then you look back at it, it's like, hang on a minute. You're burning jet fuel to get yourself to this thing where there's sports cars for people to drive around a track if they feel bored. And it's like, are you reducing your emissions? Where's your stake in this? And then
No,
you'll say,
because the we need to reduce X resource consumption is
hmm,
not I need to, it's you need to.
yeah.
It's not we, it's you.
And
It's never the person making the claim. Like the people who claim, I had an argument with my grandparents once about this topic, which got very heated, was entertaining, where they were making the overpopulation claim. It's like, well, it's very well and good for you to say that other people shouldn't be born or they should die, but you're still breathing here and you have been for 60 years. So you can say, we should have less people, but it's not me. It's those poor people, or it's the people who haven't been born yet.
I think there is an element, the seed of truth in that argument that gives it its validity. Like there's a seed of truth in every lie to make it believable. It's more complicated than that. But if you have, say, an island, there is a point at which the population is so large that they're going to cause ecological collapse, and then everyone, or almost everyone, will starve.
Okay.
It's like
I think we're walking straight back into the argument that we had last time. I want to bring it back to where we left, which was you as an individual, your specific view and map of the world. We got so deep and close to your fundamental assumptions and presuppositions. I want to bring it back to that, and I want, if possible, for you to state what you have either A, changed your mind on, or B, started to question about your previous map.
So
and things that you feel have been slightly questioned, but you are still pretty sure on. So we could see where you are, and look at that map going forward.
One of the things,
an example case.
One of the things that comes to mind. Oh, where should I start? The issue I had, the stumbling block that we had last time was me not being able to see a potential for universal revivification of the society, the Redeemer applying globally, and I think the stumbling block I had was the difference between what I would call a likely scenario, in the sense of where I say, yeah, I can see that's entirely possible given human nature and so on, and a degree of cynicism, versus is this possible full stop? And I think that's what it mainly came down to. It's probably a symptom of deeper psychological layers, and I've found a symptom of that and dealt with that, but to dive deep down into that is more suitable for a therapist's couch.
What, too personal for this kind of conversation?
Different conversation.
See, that's what I was hoping to do.
Well, we could do that too sometime.
Okay, if you find that uncomfortable, that's okay. You could perhaps make a vague reference to it without touching on the specifics.
Yeah, I think we can go deep into it in a different conversation that's sort of set aside for that, then we can think about whether or not it's
okay, so we'll pass right over that as a hiccup that you found and solved in the meantime, and then go back into the main vision and how that applies. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the positive vision that I could see for the world is based on the examples that people have achieved in their own lives. So we talk about the hypocritical environmentalists. There are also non-hypocritical ones, the people who have gone off, basically left society, and there's many examples of this, but they're not loud. They are quiet. They're just getting on with things. Like people permaculture is a prime example, and while I'm not going to say it has all the answers, it's certainly a viable path. And people who set up a food forest and are feeding a reasonable number of people and providing most of their own needs on their own property and that sort of thing. People who, instead of saying, people need to do this, you need to do that, they've gone, what can I do? And then they went and did it, and it's like, oh, I did this thing. Come on, people, come have a look. Yeah. And
yeah, people who take the step forward and actually take action to produce solutions.
Yes. And
those are redeeming people. And if the solutions are great enough, they can bring it to the culture. And if the culture is not horrible, if the average person has got their shit together enough, then that solution might be something that is upheld, assuming it's a good solution, and then the culture can implement it.
Yes.
But that's not going to happen unless you have a truly heroic individual who's able to make that leap and sacrifice their life to find that new valuable information. And then be a society who is, on average, not corrupt and lying, who is able to then accept the criticism, which anything new is, and implement a positive solution and vision. You need both.
One of the interesting things about that heroic individual who was willing to sacrifice their life, the metaphorical version is he went out to slay the dragon, prepared to die on the battlefield. But then if he manages to slay the dragon, he gets the pile of gold and the beautiful girl the dragon was hiding away and so on, within the metaphor. And in the applied example, that is going out despite all the people saying you're nuts and actually managing to set up a viable system where it's like, yeah, I recycle my nutrients, I've got my food and my fuel and my medicine and my house is warm and so on. It's like, yeah, I don't need the trappings of society anymore because I've got it all here and I'm stable and...
Yeah. For that metaphor, I want to put an asterisk on this because I think a lot of people get confused about that St. George metaphor, the story that it is. People often see it as a personal gain, like the story of the Hobbit. I will go and slay the dragon, and then I will get the reward. But the actual story is that the dragon is sitting beside a well that the townspeople use for water, and they have to sacrifice their own sheep, and when they don't have sheep, one of their women to it in order to get the water. So George goes and slays the dragon, and he gets gold, and the woman, but he gets the woman, but he brings the gold and he gives it back to the community. It's not about his personal gain, it's about bringing something of value and conquering chaos itself for the community, for the culture, not for yourself.
The reward is for your benefit to the community as a whole.
Bingo. It's both. It's both. You are rewarded by the community, which is the woman, because community member. And also you are rewarding because you have rewarded the community. It's not about getting the gold for yourself. St. George gives it back to the town as well as freeing them from the dragon that is eating them. And then one of the women it's actually the daughter of the king, I think.
That sounds
marries
poetic.
him and then he becomes king. Yeah, and he becomes king.
Yeah.
As always is the way with these stories.
Yeah.
So there's that full transformation cycle.
And the thing that seems to separate those who are approaching environmentalism hypocritically and one of the interesting things that Jordan Peterson picked out in his conversation that I was watching was that the modern environmental movement seems to be anti-human impact as their goal of that's what they need to stop, rather than pro-environment or pro-human with environment. They're anti-human impact. And
that was the big thing that struck me as well. And that's what I wanted to talk about with you today, was that any action that human beings do that in any way affects the environment that they are in is always and fundamentally bad. So that's the deepest philosophy. And I think that's right.
Yeah.
I can't see a way around that.
I think that's the dominant populist environmental viewpoint, but I disagree with that. So
that's good.
The first stories of Europeans landing in North America described being able to drive a cart between the trees. They also brought smallpox. So the thing is that you can see traces of it in the Amazon rainforest too. Like Brazil nut trees, which drop a food source, are very, very, very abundant there in certain areas. And there are areas of where the soil itself has been changed by human action through the incorporation of biochar or charcoal using processes.
Yeah, it's effectively a garden.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the first Europeans to go through they got shipwrecked on the west coast of South America, climbed over and took a raft down the Amazon, and they drifted past continuous settlement for days on end. It's like millions of people lived there, and they then all got smallpox and died, and because it's the rainforest and they built with mud, brick and wood, everything rotted quick, and 100 years later there was no sign of it. But the thing is that the North America seems to have been cultivated as a whole almost by humanity, and not as a humans dominating the environment, but there's an interplay here. There's a balance. It's a
Mm.
a give and take, a
I'd s-
partnership, which can be to
I'd
the
say that for
benefit of
sure
both.
with the South Americans.
Mm.
I would say I want to put an asterisk on that for sure with the South Americans because the evidence that is coming out now that the Amazon itself was effectively planted and grown as a cultivated forest, like a garden, by the people who lived there. And then, like you say, the people died from smallpox. Um, the story doesn't go so well for the North American Indians who were like burning the forest consistently so that the animals would escape out of the forest and then they could kill them and eat them. It's
Mm.
not quite the same image. I just wanted to make that
Yeah,
distinction.
yeah. I do have uh, a thing I trip over mentally. It's like you've got the conception of native peoples as being, they're elevated to a higher moral platform because of their being seen as being in balance with their environment. They're good, the traditional peoples in general, but is described as such. But at the same time, they can have brutal wars between tribes. They can still destroy their local environment. Their impacts are smaller because there are less of them, and the groups of them doing this are smaller than today's countries, and they don't have oil and things like that to apply the same impacts and leverage their efforts and so on. So humans are humans. We screw stuff up, we mess up all the time in a bunch of different ways, and we're always colliding with the results of our actions and trying to learn from that and making new mistakes. And the thing that separates my environmental view, to jump onto the other track, from the modern environmental view, it's like the comment that was drawn out as an example of the populist environmental view of today, that someone's saying, let me try and get the quote right, that an unspoilt vista of nature, so an unspoilt landscape, is more valuable than any number of people, one or a million, it doesn't matter, that natural, unspoilt natural environment is more valuable. I'd start again with to describe a perception of the natural world as its value is non-zero for a start. It's like, what's the value of a flower? Well, it's more than zero. Obviously, it's pretty to look at and so on, and it has some level of inherent value. And it's like, okay, well, where is
To
it?
who?
Well, sorry,
To what?
to the people who see it, a flower is very small. Right? I'm starting very
Yeah,
small.
but it just you got to
Yeah,
realize that fundamental assumption valuable to us.
but that's a human-centric thing, and I'm not finished with that. Right, so I'm going somewhere with it.
Yeah, I
Um,
just wanted to
yeah.
drop that in.
So we act as though the life of an animal is less valuable than the life of a human, right? Because we kill them to eat, and that's like, it's part of a very well established cycle of killing to eat. The And nature is not some pristine virgin, as the modern environmental perception tends to portray it. It's like red in tooth and claw. The wolf will slaughter a innocent deer that's only recently been born in order to feed her own children so that they can grow up healthy and strong. And it's like, okay, there is brutal murder and nurturing motherhood in the same paragraph, essentially. It is part of the same. And you can't separate that. Like, nature is beautiful and brutal. It's touching and tyrannical. You can make all the distinctions. It is all of the above, and we as humans are part of it. And trying to say there's humanity versus nature and it's a contest, it's like, no, it's two halves of the same. The bit that's missing from all that, to me, to get into the metaphysical a little bit, I'll have to detour to lay some foundations in the metaphysical area, but shallow ones. People discredit their own experience, these days a lot because we are taught that this is truth and it sits on the shelf or it's in the back of the book or something, and you reference that, and if your experience contradicts that, then check with the book first. Like, you think you saw something, well, check
Yeah,
what it
like
says
an
in the book.
appeal to authority or credentialism.
Exactly. But now I'm going to get the statistics a bit wrong, but something like 2/3 of people have an experience of uh, waking up
Mystical
unable to
experience.
move. Well, there's various
Oh,
types of mystical
the
experiences.
what
Hagging,
do you call it?
nightmare,
Sleep paralysis.
sleep paralysis, waking up where you feel a malicious presence in the room and then you can't move and you feel trapped. It's like that's a one type of, you could say, mystical experience that is very common, but people don't talk about it because they just dismiss it. Another one, like some sort of encounter with something you could call a ghost, is surprisingly common. It's like there is solid evidence for reincarnation when you look into it, and it's like, okay, how would you prove it or disprove it? Well, let us examine the evidence. Let us look at these past life memories people claim to have and test them. Like, you can make hypotheses and test them, and people have, and it's not perfect. Nothing ever is, but the weight of evidence falls heavily on the side of, yeah, well, that makes sense. There'll be people who disagree with me heavily on that, but that's, when I've looked into it, that's the way that seems to make the most sense to me. And to zoom out a step, um, what is the value of an animal? What is the value of a species? And then what if you perceived, as an evidence of your own experience, a guiding consciousness behind that species? What if you perceived the pain of a plant that had been harvested? What if you could hear the cry of anguish of of a hedge that had been mown? Like, imagine having a whole bunch of cuts put on your body. You'd be pretty upset, right? Imagine going to a spring and feeling the despair of the consciousness associated with that spring, at how the landscaping had been done and how it had destroyed the environment that consciousness was attempting to create. I'm describing these as lived experiences, not as this is objective truth, but I'm saying that kind of experience, which...
You're making a claim about objective truth. You're not making a claim about lived experience.
I'm making it about a lived experience because I've lived most of these.
No, okay. You are making a claim of objective truth through your lived experience. Your point about the consciousness of different things, which I don't actually disagree with. But you're making a claim that if these things were in fact the case in terms of objective truth, then a different perspective, a different map may need to be in order.
Yes, and I would argue that that map changes a lot of those assumptions. Like the idea of looking at nature from the usefulness to humanity, the prettiness to look at or something, perception, that it feels flawed. It's like, okay, you're looking at a gold bar for how useful it is to you, or looking at this diamond, or looking at this tree. It's like, okay, that's some wood we can chop up and use for things, but there is inherent value, as there is inherent value to a human life. We readily acknowledge in our society the value of a human life, but I'm saying that the value of other life is non-zero. What is it? It's a discussion that
But
needs to be
is it
had.
as much as ours? Is the suffering of a plant as much as the suffering of an infant?
We fight for our own.
Is it equal?
We fight for our own, and I think that is fair. I would certainly cut down a tree to heat my house. The reincarnation perspective brings in more background to this, that if you have life continues after death, that changes the calculus substantially compared to all ends at death. Like the vegan perception, as I understand it, of it is to kill is to destroy, and that is abhorrent, and you're trying to minimize that destruction, and any impact you have is destruction, and so it is
So instead, I will dismember living things for the rest of my life to eat in far greater number than killing an animal whose pain and suffering ends instantly.
in the sense of killing plants, well, the argument there would be that the plant is a lesser creature than an animal, and so it's like there are people who try and go all the way and say they live on nothing but air and call themselves breatharians, and it's like I have my doubts about the veracity of those claims, but the fact that those claims are there and popular speaks to the desire to live without killing and destroying. But the idea that death is not the end and it is merely a part of a cycle which spirals upwards slowly over great deals of time, it changes the landscape.
There's something. I can see the perspective of that claim, but I think it's missing a great deal.
Okay.
Particularly the vegan side. I don't think you're making that claim, particularly in terms of that's the solution, because you made the point about cutting down a tree to heat your home, which shows that you've got the right balance. But those who say they live by that, so vegans, for example, which is weird, I don't want to talk about that, but they're missing the picture of the fact that the rest of nature does not also follow this philosophy. They make this claim about the most moral thing to do because all of these creatures have sentience or spirit and they can feel all these things is to not partake in the system and to do as minimal about it as possible. It's like, well, that's great. You're worshipping nature. Isn't nature so great? Except nature doesn't do that. The deer doesn't care what leaves it eats. The wolf doesn't care which animal it kills. And you made this point yourself, the wolf will kill to eat, to feed its own kids.
And we will kill the wolf to defend ourselves.
Bingo. Or tame them, which we did, and now we don't have to kill them. Because they're our friends, and we feed them. Better life for what were wolves now than what was.
How many vegans have dogs and feed them by killing animals that... Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's always the people that go out and kill the animals themselves that they hate the most, not the ones who do the factory farming. It's always hunters that they go after, not the people who make their bacon.
And yet hunters often have a closer connection to nature than the vegans in the city, because they go out there and you look at cultures that have existed in balance with their environment for a long period of time, like 100 generations, say, and the view that they normally hold of hunting, like a ritual at the death of an animal to thank it for giving its life that they might continue to live, is a very common thing. And that's respect for nature. Like, I have killed you. I accept the responsibility to let your death not be a waste. I will make use of everything I can, and there's a spiritual element to that.
So I think we've laid out a whole bunch of these stuff, but how that applies to where we stand in the world today, which I think is the big question. We have already gone halfway up the peak of aiming at the vision. Okay, I'm going to take a step back. In terms of staying harmonious without destroying the environment and trying not to have too much suffering of humanity at the same place, you can elucidate two visions. One is the hyper-technological future. People have lots of energy and ability to do many things and eat lots, whilst also not destroying the environment through efficiency of technology. And then you have the other vision, which is incredibly low tech, but in my mind, it requires incredibly low population compared to where we are now. I don't see how you get around the heating problem, personally. If you're at one with nature, how do you warm your home without cutting a tree? Because you're not allowed to use coal or anything else. Beside the point. You have this high-tech and this low-tech solution. One, I think, allows for a large population, one doesn't. But we're in the middle. We have the large population, and we're almost at the high-tech end of things. We're coming over the curve, and people won't acknowledge that, but that's all right. And we're almost at the high-tech end. The curve of environmental impact in relation to wealth.
Okay.
So environmental impact as people get wealthy goes up for a bit because you go from like a couple of people burning dung to coal and trees, and then as it curves down the other end, you're starting to clean up your local environment, caring about renewables and etc. And then it comes down and down and down and down as efficiency goes up, which is why like the world's greener now than it was a couple decades ago by like a lot. You can thank carbon dioxide for that, environmentalists, as well as the technology. But I see from where we are, we can go to either way. The environmentalists who think that all human impact on the environment is fundamentally unethical are aiming at the other way, the low-tech solution. Though they do not intend to be around for living that way, unless they just cull the rest of the population and live in the high-tech solution with like a couple of million people, just them, which might actually be the real solution, which is more horrific for what they want to do. But in order to get there, a massive cull of the population is required. There's no way around that, as well as removing all of the technology and resources that give us healthy and happy lives. The things that feed us, the things that transport us, the things that keep us healthy, hospitals, medicines, vaccines, though they love them so much, those will all be gone in this low-tech environment. It will go back to a state of nature, disease, famine, death, being consumed by nature herself. And I think the paradisal image that is embedded in that one with nature environment is pathological, because we have this image of the Native Americans, like you say, although I actually think they were closer towards the higher tech solution than the lower one, but that's a argument about history to be had. I think that image of the tribe who's at one with nature and is eating and gathering and doing rituals is, as always, half the coin. I think the side that the environmentalists are missing in that image is the other side, which is like 1 in 3 women dying in childbirth, something about the same of kids dying every time they're born, disease, famine, not getting enough nutrients, low brain development, low growth, no one getting enough food to grow up and become an adult effectively. Unbelievably savage cultural rituals, murdering each other, cannibalism, rape, all these kinds of things, unbelievably prevalent in those kinds of early societies. They were not peaceful, loving people. And their world was not at one perfect harmony with nature. It was disease and predation on them, not against the nature. There's not a balance there. Or if there is, it's not one that's in favour of human beings or reducing their suffering. It's one that's in favour of the environment.
From our present situation, if we try and go for the low-tech approach, then that will increase our impact, because then we'll be cutting down more trees. And
yes, which is what has happened.
You can cut down a tree as long as... Okay. A tree is not the whole environment. A tree is one part of it. You have a forest. You take out one tree, you grow one more. You take out one, you grow one more. The system is balanced. It's a cycle. And so like you can ethically heat your home. You can have a wood lot where you coppice the trees, and the trees actually live longer that way. You can set it up so that it's a full ecology. You just happen to be part of it, and every now and again you take a tree and burn it. I don't know if the high-tech approach as you see it would work, but I'm not against trying, as long as it's not going to cause more destruction in that attempt. But frankly, we have to try at small scale and see.
It's working so far. Until we made this correction back to the way of moving away from, the best energy sources we have, it was working. Like the 15% of the world regrowth in trees, which is what the size of the United States, or the contiguous United States.
So in that video, didn't he assign that to increase in CO2 levels, meaning plants could keep their pores closed more, and so they didn't need as much water to grow,
Hmm.
so they could grow more in arid
Yep.
areas.
Yep. The taiga forest is melting, which means that trees can grow further north and south than they used to. Um, the equators are becoming more green and more rainforest. We're getting more rain and more cloud cover, which does mean a hotter planet in one sense, but on the other sense, oh yeah, that's the thing that I've been meaning to ask you, seeing as you're an environmentalist in this perspective. Are you aware about the data showing what the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere does to the feedback effect? Because
Which
you
one?
know that the climate models. Okay, so climate models are all based on a positive feedback loop. We increase the temperature of the globe 2 degrees, for example, and then they say that 2 degrees will therefore increase it 1 more degree, and then half a degree, etc., in terms of a feedback loop. That's how all the models are based in which they predict climate catastrophe. However, the data shows the opposite. You put more CO2 into the atmosphere, yes, it warms at 2 degrees, but then you have more cloud cover and more rain, which reflects more light into space, and that actually cools the planet by 0.5. So you increase it 2 degrees, it'll cool it to 1. So yes, you get the initial boost of heat, but over time, the negative feedback loop, it actually cools the planet. No runaway disastrous effect turning us into
I certainly
Venus.
used to be much more worried about climate change than I am now. I'm not sure if I was on the apocalyptic end of belief toward climate change, but the
Okay, maybe we can make a distinction here. We'll jump in and make a distinction because this often gets muddled up between climate and environment. These are separate things.
Yeah.
So maybe we should separate this out in our discussion, because thinking back on all the discussions we've had, you've always been very concerned about the environment itself, the ecosystems, the ocean, not so much the CO2 stuff. Even though you're rather concerned about fossil fuels, I think that's more related to the limited nature of them and the taking from a system that is not replenishable, rather than the externalization cost of CO2 emitted, assuming that it's a bad thing. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. I'd put CO2 as, and of course this is something that everyone would argue. Everyone has their own position on this, and so cue a million arguments in the background. But my personal position on it is, it would be better not to have it. But it's not the end of the world. The planet has been through far worse than us in the past. And the planet will be fine. Whether civilization as we know it can get through this, I doubt that. Humanity, yes.
Because of the limited nature of the resource, because of the externalized cost, the cost of the environment.
Both.
Specifically from CO2.
Yeah, so the shifting of productive areas of land and the costs imposed by needing to abandon and rebuild infrastructure in various places will...
Okay, that assumes...
Well, for example...
That assumes, in my mind, sea level rise and heat or desert expansion. When you say removing of areas, what do you mean?
Yes, basically. Those two and others, say areas where it's no longer suitable for certain types of infrastructure, and that infrastructure that's already built there then has to be abandoned. The areas of Western US...
Can you give any specifics on that?
In terms of specific examples?
Yeah.
Well, sea level rise and desertification in certain areas are the obvious examples. Sea level rise.
Do you have any data that shows that that's likely to happen?
What data would you find compelling? Because the obvious ones come to mind, but I suspect they also come to mind for you.
Let's start there.
The fact, to my mind, the fact of the sea rising as a whole was pretty well settled. The expansion of water due to increasing temperature, the reduction in land-based ice, with the water then running into the ocean, causing an increase in the height of said ocean and swamping low-lying areas over time.
Okay. What time? Over what time would increase in sea level? So it's easy to have a catastrophic vision about the sea level rising and washing out all kinds of places that we might use and then having to rebuild somewhere else. It's also easy to have a catastrophic vision of having to move away from the equator because it's too hot or deserts expanding and stuff. But I find it very, very interesting how often when you press someone who has this vision on this, it's how much is it going to rise? How fast? Or where are the deserts going to expand? How fast? And why do you think that?
In terms of the sea level rise, I don't have the numbers to hand, but I'd say, would it be half a metre over the next century type thing? It's not a day after tomorrow type scenario where suddenly a 100-metre high tsunami just washes through and then the sea's higher. It's
Is that based on the positive feedback loop of CO2, as mentioned before?
based on the current trend line mainly. It's
Which is a data model projection based on what factor of feedback loop?
true. I would agree that there will be negative feedback loops in there. I think that the current climate models, while certainly flawed, are some of the most educated guesses we have.
Okay. Are you aware that anything does not include a positive feedback loop of over 1.8 is not funded by the UN? Anything that indicates the opposite of that is not funded.
I wasn't aware of that. That certainly seems like a way to skew the data.
Especially when the data actually says the opposite. Look, I think arguing about the details about what is going to happen is kind of pointless because no one knows.
Yeah, and fundamentally,
So we can say
yeah,
we're concerned. Okay, let's take it back. We're concerned about you, in your vision, are concerned about these particular issues and the cost that that may have for humanity.
yeah.
Weighed against what benefit? So why should we be concerned about these costs? Why should we take action
The
against them?
main
What's the cost to us?
costs that I would personally foresee, there'd certainly be a climate cost, I would say, due to shifting climatic zones, and this area gets greener and this area gets more arid and so on. That's possibly of more geopolitical interest than survival of humanity. So if a country that was a net exporter of food to a substantial degree, or has a large population or something, or the western half of the US in California where a large amount of food is grown, becoming more arid and unable to support substantial agriculture, there'll be ripple effects on that and it'll change a lot of stuff, but it wouldn't be catastrophic on its own. The big issue and my big concern is oil ceasing its growth and beginning a slow decline in terms of the available energy to deal with whatever other problems there are. So I'd expect the decline to mirror the rise, so say 300 years in the future we'll have not much oil being produced at all, but it takes a while to get there with a lot of bumpiness along the way.
So that really is your fundamental thing, is your concern about the limited nature of oil. All of these other things are sort of knock-on effects, other issues that we've been arguing around, but that's really the fundamental thing, isn't it?
Because most problems can be solved, or at least substantially soothed, if you can apply a lot of effort to solving them. But if the bulldozer or if the tractor runs out of diesel, you can't really grow food in the modern system.
It's not easy. No, we can't milk the cows if we don't have the shed running.
We
need energy to do that.
You can't feed the current population if the diesel runs out. You could grow enough to feed yourself and a few others.
Yes, 100%.
Okay. Yeah. There's a reason 90% of the population used to grow the food for 10%, and
I want to bring this back to this map because we keep getting distracted and arguing about issues here and there, and that's probably my fault. I'm stupid, whatever.
Yeah, we both are.
But that's, yeah, it's difficult, technically. But anyone can argue about those issues, and lots of smart people do, smarter than us. And there's no way to make an accurate prediction and test it without waiting a long time. And in the meantime, you will suffer whatever consequences that you're complaining about anyway. So it's kind of pointless. I think the really important stuff is to look at the map. Okay, there's something I want to add on to this afterwards, but I want to remind me to get back to it about the individual and the vision forward, because that's what we're trying to get to. When we left off last, your map was, I think, far more towards the environmentalist side, the modern one, than you are standing right now. I think you've actually changed quite a bit. Might be enough to make a boundary difference.
Yeah.
But a balance of a couple notches here and a couple notches on the opposite scale can compound quite a lot. Your vision of nature is very well articulated, so I think that one we can put aside. Your vision of culture and the individual, I think, is what we should be focusing on. And we keep arguing about the details of nature.
I'll readily acknowledge that. Yeah. I'll readily acknowledge that my view of culture and the individual is much lower definition than my vision of nature and energy and systems, because I'm an engineer. Energy and systems and the way that works is fun and simple-ish. None of it's simple.
You've latched yourself onto this graph that you've seen predicted of oil, and I'm not saying you're wrong. You probably know a hell of a lot more about that than I do. And you've claimed onto that, and knowing that those two other things are not well articulated about the future, sort of going, well, this is my map of the future, and I can follow this graph, and the trend of society will exactly follow the graph of oil. There's nothing else I need to take into account. And I think that's the issue, because your vision of society able to take any action, or the revivifying, heroic individual taking action to inform the society to take action, to change, to separate from the growth of oil, or lack of, in your eyes. I think that's where we need to be focusing the attention in this conversation, because we can argue about all these other things, and everyone does.
The idea that a heroic individual can separate the path of a group of heroic individuals can separate their collective path from the resource constraints. How are we defining...
Even one is enough. History's shown that one pretty well.
How are we defining
I just wanted to make the point. Yeah. Okay. I just want to make the point before we go into details.
Okay.
Before we go into details, I'll make the point that this conversation will be valuable to those who are in the modern environmentalist camp who are still open-minded. That I think if they see the contradictory map, and they, perhaps like you, are more on the balance side of the environment, which I think a lot of the environmentalists are, who are sort of concerned but then also wary of where these other people are going. If we can elucidate the vision, both sides of the map for the culture, and then a positive vision for that, and then both sides of the map of the individual, and then a positive vision for that, and then link all three of the positive together in a vision for the future for that, then that gives a path forward where the environment is protected and saved, where culture is put back together without falling to pieces, and where the individual doesn't suffer and starve and kill each other, which is what we want.
And
right?
Finding paths, or at least stepping stones forward, where the details of a lot of the less certain stuff don't actually matter that much.
Bingo. Because, yeah, you can argue about fish or whatever particular policy works with that, or pollution and whatever particular policy works with that. But a million people can do that. and that's not helpful. What we need to be working on is the way that individuals view the world and then act in the world, because that's the only way to solve the problem. Get a correct map, get your psychology in order, and then act forthrightly in the world, make it better. Because if you won't make the world better, not in screaming to have the force of tyrannical government to force everyone to act better, but to act better yourself, then no one will, and the world won't get better. Because if all of you are corrupt in such a way that I won't act to make the world better or the environment better, but I'll call for the government to act to make the environment better, and then expect that that government will be not at all corrupt like I am and everyone who called and voted it for, but perfectly able to implement the vision without any corruption. So it's not going to happen. It'll be as corrupt as you are and probably more.
I think it's worth saying that or at least discussing that a lot of the people who are protesting in the way you described about the environmental situation, at least my sense of it, is that it's driven by desperation. Like, there have been many protests about climate change for quite a long time, and they haven't worked, basically. We're still burning lots of coal, lots of oil, and the same things are still happening. And they're getting more shrill in their demands and their protests and gluing hands to things and throwing soup at things in an effort to get attention to bring about a change, like get the leaders to change the direction of the society. But to those who aren't already basically on board with that, it doesn't make much difference. Those who are further away just look at that and think, what are those crazies doing, rather than having their base assumptions challenged. If you have people who look at the issues and then, okay, I believe this. We need to cut down CO2. We need to make real change. What does that look like in my life? People who were reasonably high-flying in whatever career path they chose and left that to go and follow their conscience for what they saw as the right path. And people can argue about what the best path is, but the ones whose quiet words are most potent are those who spent their time doing something instead of talking. And I can appreciate the conviction of the people who push away their body's cravings for meat in order to only eat a plant diet because they think that is the thing they need to do to save the world. There's an element of self-sacrifice for the good of the planet there that's commendable. But I don't think it's making that much of a difference. The people who are going and raising chickens and making their own lives the way they want the world to be, that's where the real change is starting. And there's various videos of that. Happen Films is a good YouTube channel that's got a whole bunch of that documented in New Zealand. One I remember is a financier from Australia who sold all that career and then came and now runs a market garden in New Zealand, and he feeds people, and it's like, what? That's a change. And yeah, I think I've made that point well-rounded enough that, yeah, bring about the change in your own life.
I think it's worth putting in also that there is definitely a place for collective action in terms of government. This is something that we talked about before that I still haven't got around to. Is I have come around on this a lot, and that there is a place for collective action to be taken. But I think the real problem is that these environmentalists stand up and they say, we need to stop doing this right now and replace it with, I don't know.
Yeah.
Wind farms.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like in that conversation that you were listening to, it's all well and good to say that, the use of fossil fuels, the use of trees for stuff, or the use for whales for oil, is such a problem, and you should stop. It's like, great, I'll just, freeze and stuff. Brilliant. Thanks for that. It's like, no, I won't. And as human beings, we're wired to survive. It's not going to happen. Sorry, too bright. Sweating. It's not going to happen. The solution is never to say that we have to stop using the thing that makes us survive. It's not going to work. And we can't ask people to do that. And we can't force people to do that, because that might as well be genocide, or it would be.
Yeah, if you ask, they'll laugh at you. If you try and force them, they will stop you or die trying.
Oh yes. If you try and shut off oil, I don't know. The farmers will do something. I can tell you that. And even in New Zealand, it's like they have all of the guns. And it's like, yes, they still have them.
Yeah. I'm very conflicted on the oil point. Yep, you finish.
You have to have a positive vision forward. You can't stand there as the left does. And I don't mean this to go, the left. It's like, this is what liberals do, is they look at the hierarchy and say, here's a problem. And the conservatives say, yeah, but here's what it's for. Like, if you want to have a vision for the future that is positive, where humanity does not suffer and die unnecessarily, you have to integrate both the perspective of the left-wing individuals and the right-wing individuals, because much to the contrary of popular opinion, both sides have a point. Both sides are right and wrong. You cannot have a vision for the future that only leans on one ideological side, or one political spectrum, because if you do, everyone will die. And this is always what happens. For environmental, for example, you need to have a vision forward. Use of fossil fuels is a problem. What is our solution? It's not wind farms, because people haven't done enough interest or investigation into that. You can say renewables in general. Okay, is it stopping all fossil fuels today and starting renewables? No, we're probably still going to be using them for 150 years, something like that. And that's not bad. And we can stand up today and say, the use of these things are wrong, and we need to stop them and find something else. But it's not going to be today. It's going to be a goal that we work and invest over a millennium, or a century, of collective resources to develop something new that can replace them in a better way, that people do not starve or freeze or fall into disease.
The example of Sri Lanka trying to cut off all artificial fertilizers immediately, and then their food production dropping, and by the predictable amount when you take conventional agriculture and cut off the food supplies. I think you can still feed everyone, but you'd have, here's a dozen test farms out of 100 that are trying different systems. Half of them didn't do so well. Oh, that one's doing okay. Oh, that one's doing okay after a little while. Okay. Should we transition another 5 to the new system? Okay. Production's coming up on the ones that went first. Okay, that one's not doing so well. Okay, there are some issues.
By whose authority? Who's the central planner sitting at the center of the system deciding, you get to do it this way, you get to do it that way? We're going to shift your farm to produce this way.
Yeah, it doesn't
And
practically
then
work
how
out
do
for
they
them.
make people do that? How are we going to make the farmers farm that way? What happens if they don't?
I think we're getting the test cases by individual action. We're getting people doing it on their own, for themselves, to work out which systems work. And I personally think that the availability of oil and affordability of oil is going to continue becoming problematic in a bumpy increase over time, as the existing oil fields slowly deplete and the newly discovered ones can't keep up with the shortfall. And as it gets more expensive to produce artificial fertilizers, that would be a competitive disadvantage to farms that continue to rely on them. So I
Through
suspect
market pressures, I'm sure that'll
Yeah,
Smooth
yeah.
over. Okay. So energy is everything. I think we're both in a hell of agreement on that.
Keystone, yeah.
You see slowing down and reduce of fossil fuels as a huge problem.
Hmm.
And it is.
Hmm.
What is the solution for that? Is it not using any form of energy anymore and going back to trees? Which is the low-tech vision.
Going back to trees is still not... Okay, there's a series of stages here. Um, if
This
you...
is what your steam-powered company is based on, is that
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
no other solution.
Let me get the context. So if you
Oh, I
go...
get I get the context of your engine, and I get the context of having a self-sustained ecological system of using trees
Hmm.
for fuel. There's not enough
Yep,
trees
totally
on the
agree.
planet for humanity as it is. So
Yeah.
in order to have your low-tech vision, a whole lot of people are going to die. And that's either going to be through pure chaos, which will be unbelievably horrific, like no one can
Hmm.
imagine, or it'll be through force, which is also going to be
Hmm.
unbelievably horrific.
If
And
you were
you'll
to...
probably be in the bin that's cast into the oven. So
If you
I don't
tried
see that as the vision
to...
that you want.
If you try to run current society off biomass, yes, I agree that the kind of catastrophic death and murder and die off that you're describing would be needed before that would be possible. I
So
don't
why
think
have that as your vision for the future? Why work on it?
because I look at the if you compare the energy used to become to climb out of privation and poverty to a stable life. Right. If you look at the demands of that and compare that with the modern Western lifestyle, there's an orders of magnitude of difference there. I would say that there's a lot that could be done differently. So, for example, in the US, the average to pluck the figure out, I think this is right, but per capita is about 4 times the energy use in America compared to Europe. That would imply
And
that there's room
unbelievably more compared to starving nations.
absolutely, but also a whole lot more
Okay.
compared to nations that are not starving but not extravagant. So there's a middle there
I,
somewhere.
I think I think we know where you're going with this.
Hmm.
But my real question is, you have this technology that you've been working on as part of this
Hmm.
company. Are you suggesting, and let's say this for the whole nation, the whole world, you have this vision of a low-tech solution for many things. Are you suggesting this should be given to people who are at the bottom of the ladder, who are trying to move up to make it more sustainable for them to move up, or that those at the top of the ladder should be dragged down and set at this level and not allowed to move above?
I want to give this to the farmers on the bottom. Right. I
That's definitely a positive vision.
Yep. So one prime example, Fiji exports wood chip
We've done
to.
this one before, but you've
Yep.
ignored the second half of the question.
I will get to it. Right. So they're exporting wood chip to buy diesel to run generators. Why not just burn the wood chip to generate your electricity and so on? That's a better
Yeah.
system. If we look at the other half of the question and give it its well-deserved attention, um, I don't think that the high energy use of a current Western society, the richer 10% of the world, can be maintained as it is. I don't propose to drag it down by force. I would personally propose get on with building the solutions that work for the third world countries, the developing countries, whichever soundbite version you want to use to describe them. I would work on building the solution that works for them and then just wait and leave the Western system alone. And if the high tech solutions come along and that lifestyle can be maintained in an ongoing, sustainable way, then, oh, well, that was a surprise, but I'm not going to be fighting that. I would want
But you
to.
don't believe it.
I don't believe it. So I'm
Okay.
working on something to catch them when the they start sliding
Inevitable
down.
fall.
Yeah, yeah. If I'm wrong about that, then well, fine. I won't have. It won't be a loss if I'm wrong about that. I fear the lifestyles continuing to destroy the planet. I'm not going to try and drag
So,
them down. I'm going to try and lead by example and make my own life what I want it to be, as I am able to. But, and I personally think that's a better life. It's like pursuing greater physical stuff and the latest brand name handbag or shoes or car or whatever. It's like, I got a car from the 90s because it's reliable and it'll keep going for decades if I take care of it and so on. I didn't want a new car. I wanted one that
mm,
wasn't made before they switched out the metal bits to plastic bits because I wanted it to keep
right, and
going.
your moral philosophy is the thing that guided your decision there, which is what we need, not the imposition of force to deny you of resources that you wish to have.
Yeah. There's also an element there where I get conflicted regarding the oil scenario. When I look at where I think oil will go in the future, in terms of there being less of it, it's not going to be a suddenly the taps got turned off and it's the end of the world. It's, oh, not as much came out as we would have liked. Oh, okay. Well, it got a bit more expensive. Oh, we can't afford to do all the same things. And stuff gets a little. Belts get a little tightened in an economic sense. And sort of repeated cycles of that. There's an up, there's a down, there's an up, there's a down, but the general trend is down over time in terms of per capita energy use. Um, and I want to be ahead of that curve so I'm not being dragged down, kicking and screaming with it, because then I can sort of make my preparations and it's a hell of a lot more comfortable. I see it as there's a lot of extraneous and disadvantageous deadwood in the system at the moment. There's a lot of poisonous fat in a lot of senses. Like there's a lot of my personal views in that, and sure, a lot of the stuff that I think is not so great will probably still hang around in some shape or form. But if people want to use their resources to do a thing that I think is a waste of time, it's like, okay, you go do your drag races with ethanol that you collected over the entire year. I think it's silly, but yeah, you grow it, you go it. Um, I want to do something that will be able to cushion that fall. And if we have a way to, if we can start the preparations now and then have a way to convert the trees we've been planting now into motive effort to plough fields so that we can still have food and then transport that food to the cities, then that's a hell of a lot better than suddenly you can't afford the diesel and so food price goes up by 10 times. Maybe it'll only go up by 3 or 5 times, and it's still not pretty, and I'm not looking forward to it, but that's the sort of impact I hope to have. I think I got lost in that, but oh, I hope it was interesting.
So it's hard to go anywhere from here
Mm.
because your philosophy is still very much of the environmentalist bent, though you have a good balance in terms of the positive and negative aspects of nature. Your positive vision of culture is somewhat there with the investment in low-tech things as your basis of the solution, but your positive vision of an individual able to make some form of new invention or discovery that curbs this catastrophe of oil that you see is, well, it's not there at all.
Yeah, I'm not betting on
So
that.
no, right. I want to elucidate a positive vision with you because you are concerned about the environment in a way that I'm not particularly concerned, because I think the balance of that would make a good case for what positive things we could do that serve both humanity and its culture and the environment. Though I think the point about individual moral decisions is everything.
Hmm.
Like you say, those who consume the designer handbags and the new phone and car every year are not helping. But then again, who are we to tell them not to? We don't get to decide what people are allowed and not allowed to live with.
I feel sorry for those people to a large degree because
So do I. They're not happy.
not
They're not
happy
happy
and
people.
not lining themselves up well to deal with the future as I see it. I might be wrong about
Well,
that, but
I don't think you are either, but that's beside the point. Sorry, couldn't help but do that little dig. I don't think that we're able to elucidate a positive vision for the future or think about solutions for the future unless you think that there is actually a possibility of that happening. And I see you taking this as almost a fundamental assumption that there is no idea or no possible solution that is even worth considering that could therefore slow this curve. That the curve is already given and already happened, and I'm going to work for solutions for after it falls. There's no point wasting time about a way to stop or slow or even not even have the collapse. That's going to happen anyway.
so
Apologies,
what are you
I'm running out of
defining as
battery.
positive in this context? What is the
Okay,
goal?
a way for you see this curve of energy as terms of oil going peaking and then collapsing, and you see society taking the exact same tree. Apologies, someone must have fallen over. You don't see any possible way of getting off oil as the fundamental energy and going and keeping going. You see it as unbelievably stuck to oil. That oil is going to collapse, and we're never going to use anything other than oil. So there's no point even trying, and we must work on the solution for when we have no oil.
I don't see it as technically possible to get the kind of quantity of energy that we get from oil from other sources. I see positive things, I see positive possibilities, but that's not something I count as a possibility.
Why?
A great deal of effort has gone into various candidates for replacing oil over the past decades. None of them can outcompete oil, or they would have already done it to start with. There is an argument that's made along the lines of certain technologies being suppressed. Possible, or not impossible. If a suppressed technology that means a car can run on water comes out, then, oh, that's a surprise. How do I build one? And
I think we should leave that conversation aside, or we get in big trouble. We've had those conversations as a hint before, and God, they were fun.
I'm leaving that out of the predictive framework. In terms of doing something that's not as much as oil, I think there are some possibilities, but I think that the amount that we'll be able to replace is nowhere near the total. So we're looking at a fraction of the current per capita energy usage. Things like, if you build a hydro dam, there are some ecological concerns, some ways of making them not so bad, yada yada. If you have a hydro dam with a steady rainfall behind it, it fills up, you have the water go through, that's a great source of energy, right? And you can do a ton with that. Ours is the first civilization to use mechanical energy that's not from a muscle for most of its energy source, and that leads to interesting philosophical stuff about us versus previous civilizations and then future civilizations and what that'll look like and so on. But yeah, I come back to we can't do everything that we're doing with oil now after oil. There's nothing that'll replace it. There are certainly things like solar panels, okay?
You don't see anything with the potential through more investment and evolution of the technology that could become more efficient to replace it.
If we pull on nuclear as a example of that sort of thing that's talked about that way, there may be nuclear.
That's where I put my money.
Yeah, there may be nuclear plants that come out in the future that can do a lot, right? Nuclear, as it stands now, is still subsidized by oil and fossil fuels. So the mining of the uranium, the building of the plant, the manufacturing of all the machinery is basically powered by oil. If it's all powered by electricity from a nuclear plant, I think the equation would be more difficult. Possibly still worthwhile. A nuclear plant of the, I'm not sure which technical generation it is, but the type that's commonly in use these days, um, is that third generation?
I think third generation. I think fourth is
Okay.
the most recent one, but there's not many of them yet.
Okay. Third generation can't do it as I understand it. It doesn't stack up economically over its lifetime without big subsidies to make it keep going. Fourth generation may come out better, but I've I deliberately don't hang my hat on. I don't include in my future analysis things that aren't yet here and working and proven. If new stuff
Okay,
comes
then you'll
along,
never have a positive vision.
I'll never have a
You can
vision.
never have a positive vision unless you take into account things that you don't know. Okay, right. I think we've just hit the nail on the head. If you do not take into account the ability for individuals or groups of individuals to encounter the unknown and extract out of it information that we can use to make the world better, then your vision will always be negative.
I think we have
It will
different
always be
definitions
a
of better.
collapse into nature. No, I think I hard disagree with you on that. The all the death that we described is not better than
Yes,
the idea
agree there.
of a positive vision. But my point is, if you do not take into account your map of the future, the interplay between the individual, the environment, and then the social world, and the process of taking out information from the unknown and bringing it into the known, learning, if you do not take into account the ability of humanity to learn new things, then your vision will always be one of failure and fall back to old times. You're not capable of having a positive vision without assuming that humanity can learn and do new things.
I think part of the assumption that I have that feeds into that is that as things get more complex, the cost of maintaining that complexity rises. And sure, as you get better at it, the cost per unit of complexity reduces. So the first 100 transistor chip cost a lot of money. Now a 100 transistor chip is pittance. But as the complexity continues to rise, the cost of maintaining that complexity also rises to in some relationship. And
The
eventually,
amount of population,
I'm not thinking of it in
proportionate
terms
to
of
the population.
population.
No, but it is. You cannot have a entirely complex society without enough population to support the specialization required to research and to sustain that complex society. Producing a single transistor is really expensive and really hard when you have 10 people. When you have, 500 million working on it, as we probably do now, it ends up being a lot easier than you might think. Because 500 million brains working on a single problem is really useful. A lot
Yes,
more than, a couple dozen working on the first idea of it.
there's an energy component to it as well in terms of having the energy to give that 500 million working on making transistors all the tools that they need to work on transistors. If you only have
Agreed,
enough.
which is why for me personally, seeing as we've always been focusing on you, my positive vision of the future is entirely energy based. That if we get our act together in terms of investment in energy, that then that energy can compound and produce all kinds of abundance and reduction of suffering for humanity. That is the only way forward. Positive vision for energy. That's it. Everything else is politicking and background arguments. If you don't
It,
have that, we have nothing.
so, in your positive vision for energy, you. I'm not sure what the right term would be for it, but you imagine sufficient energy to replace oil being developed.
I think this is where we should leave it
Mm.
as a transition into our conversation about a positive vision tomorrow.
Okay.
Because we spend a lot of time focusing on you and why we don't think you have a positive vision
Mm.
for all the reasons that you've described. And I think you've actually made really good arguments. Just because I haven't gone with them and I've been very pushing back, they're very convincing and you've thought out your positions very well. All credit to you for that.
And I see it as...
I still...
I feel like it's positive.
Yeah, I don't. Not at all. Sorry, I think that's a very negative vision, and I think you found a way to paint it rose gold so that it's not so horrifying, but it is.
Quite plausible.
Because you keep mentioning all of these deaths that are required to make this vision come to a reality, and then you just sweep it away like I'm not going to think about that's required in my vision for the future, but it is. You could talk about your vision for the future is after that, the cushion from the fall, and won't it be not so bad when we do this? But it's like all of that has to happen first. And if you're not engaged in that, it's probably going to happen in the worst way possible and you won't be able to catch anyone afterwards. Beside the point. After all of this talk and all the discussion we had last time, I think this really comes down to it, is that you have a very accurate map of nature itself, as you focused a lot on that, and we can, due to your spiritual leanings, let's say. And it's very well elucidated. You've got positive and negative aspects down. You've got that right. You don't have an accurate map of culture, as far as I can see. And you don't have an accurate map of the individual. And for some reason, you don't seem to believe that the individual can take out new information from nature, from chaos, make it comprehensible and bring it into culture to enrich the society. You don't seem to believe that human beings can learn, because all of your visions for the future include no new development of technology, only collapsing of everything we've ever built and back down to old technology. That's the diagnosis that I see of why you're not able to have a positive vision. And then you have all of these reasons and these articulations based in the facts that you've seen that are very well thought out. But it's all interpreted by your map, as we did in the first conversation. I don't want to keep arguing with you about that because I don't think it's helpful. Yep. And it's going to feel a bit like an attack. And besides, we've gone long enough today. I think we should leave it.
Yeah. I think I see the well as dry more than the...
Okay.
More than people can't go out and bring new things in. I think that the well of things, of new things to draw on, or the mine has run low, so there's very little left of worth.
I'm going to say I think that's kind of laughably arrogant. Like, it's hilarious to me because, like, less than 150 years ago we were burning, whale oil lanterns to read books in the dark. Like, this is very new, this world that we have, and,
So by the fact of its newness, that implies that its depths have yet to be fully plumbed because there hasn't been enough time.
I think oil is a pathetically low energy return system based on where we're going to go. As far as I'm concerned, that is the first stepping stone, and we're going to rocket off to something else. And we've barely even touched it, the energy future. Let's leave that aside.
Yeah, I want to hear your positive vision.
I think that's what we should do tomorrow.
Okay.
Is that instead of focusing on you, and I think we've done the diagnosis as best we can, I'll walk through the positive vision that I have and try and bring in both sides of the argument, because I don't like this one-sided stuff, and I don't think... Okay, there's a political thing there that I want to mention about our nation, which would be interesting, because you're actually in my country, and we can talk about that. Do that tomorrow, positive vision, and how I see the world. And maybe that'll be helpful, and then maybe like a week after you could think about it, we could come back and we could see if you have any change or any critiques or criticisms about my vision. We could go from there. How does that sound?
Sounds good, and I'll do my best to be, what would the term be, helpfully combative?
As I do.
And it is appreciated.
Technically difficult.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. Anyway, I think we should leave it there. I think a good conversation for the evening. You happy?
Yep, I am.
Yeah.
Oh.
Brilliant. Well, we'll sign off and we'll see y'all tomorrow.
Yep. Thank you, as long as the plans for tomorrow work, but anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
Enough
We're
enough for
working
one
tomorrow, so.
video.
Yes, I think we've done plenty, and I think it's a good point to leave it because it gives us an aim of somewhere to go next time.
Yep. Okay. Farewell.